All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining today. We're just going to give it a minute or two so that we can let some people start getting logged on. So I'll be talking to you in just a moment. All right, just for everyone who just joined us, we're just waiting another minute or so since people are just starting to log on, and then we'll be talking to you real soon. All right, let's get started. So thanks everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Progressive Delivery, Releasing Continuously Without Risk Using Feature Flags. Just a few things up top to let you all know before we dive in. One, we are recording. So if for any reason you need to drop or you have a colleague who's unable to join, they will be able to view this later on. Two, you can ask questions. We're going to have a bit of time at the end for questions. So as soon as you think of one, please go right ahead and ask it. Even if you think maybe we'll answer it during the course of the presentation, we'd rather know what it is that you want to ask about. So please, as soon as you think of one, go right ahead. I don't want to take up much more time before we get started. We have a lot to get through. So why don't we go through, for today, we're going to be talking about, as you can see, background to feature flagging and progressive delivery, some use cases and benefits for testing and production. We're going to have a live demo and then the Q&A section. We got two speakers today, both from CloudBees. One in product marketing is Nick Rendell, who'll be starting us off in just a moment. And Elliot Landon, one of our solutions architects, is going to be doing our demo for us. So without further ado, why don't we get started? Nick, you want to kick us off?
Thank you, Max. All right, so we're gonna dive into kind of the details and the who's and what's of progressive delivery in just a moment. But before we did that, we wanted to kind of give a high-level overview of what feature flags are, just in case there's some folks that are newer to this concept on the call today. So what is a feature flag? They are also known as feature flippers, feature toggles, all that of the sort. In the simplest term, a feature flag is an if statement in your code. So if something happens, then something else will happen as well, and it'll happen without redeploying the application. That's very important. Feature flags, they're not brand new technology by any means. They've actually been used by developers for some time. However, the formal usage and management of feature flags across organizations, this was pioneered, in the last decade by some of the more well-known software development titans, such as Netflix, Uber, Facebook, all the sorts. So we would kind of move from the stage where this is a really useful tool used by developers into like formal use of feature flag management across small, medium, and large-sized companies. So we were curious just before we started to get kind of a tab on the audience today, and we were going to do a very quick poll just to see, who is using feature flags today, who isn't, and that sort of thing, just so that we know kind of how to tailor the content for the rest of the presentation. So you should see a poll up on your screen. If you want to just click the button real quick, we will get a feeling on results.
All right, so starting to see votes come in. Just for everyone who's watching along, the question is, how is your company using feature flags today? You can select from no usage, using a homegrown or open source flags today, using a third-party platform, or you don't know. And so far the votes are pretty interesting. It's really focusing on just a few. I'll share all these with you in just a minute. Let's maybe give this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, now just to share with everyone. Nick, do you want to say anything about these before we move on?
Yeah, so for the folks that did vote, thank you. I don't think this is really a surprise. I think what we're seeing largely today with folks that we talk to is as many people start using a homegrown system. So like we said, this is not brand new technology. In fact, a lot of developers are using this today in their code. It's just kind of like not known throughout the organization. And what we're seeing generally is folks tend to use a homegrown system and up to a certain point, and then they're looking at how can I scale this. My management is super interested in using this technology across all development teams. How do we do this? And that's very common today, kind of where their usage in the market is. So good. Okay, so moving on into progressive delivery. Before we talk about that, let's kind of talk about releases today and the status quo of many companies out there that are not doing progressive delivery, and kind of where every company was largely in the last few decades. So one of the things that drives release managers nuts and development teams nuts is that test environments and internal quality assurance can't fully reflect production. There are just simply growing complexities in production that can't be recreated in the test environment. Like drastic capacity increases of usage, heavily customized user environments, all this sort of thing. Look no further than a company like Netflix, and all of the the very varied customizations and usage levels of Netflix, particularly right now with COVID and that sort of thing. It would just be truly impossible to create a test environment that reflected reality across the millions of households that are growing in their consumption of Netflix today. Perfect example there. And what does this equal is, you have test environments that don't equal production, but you have test environments where you want to try and create as many potential scenarios of production as possible before any feature is released. So, of course you can do that, to the best of your ability, but what that takes is time, and time is money, as we'll say. Time is less features getting out the door. This is, your competition potentially getting more out, that affects user acquisition, that affects user retention, all of those sort of, high level business metrics that you like to think about. So, slower releases overall. And finally, when a new feature is released, in the dark ages before progressive delivery, and for some folks that maybe aren't doing this today, it's a big bang release, right? And this, any release manager, any development manager will tell you this is one of the most stressful days of the month, right? Because you might have something completely break when it goes live. Users might hate it. You might have development teams scrambling to create an emergency patch on the fly because there was an element in production that wasn't anticipated. Lots of things, and so big bangs are scary. And there's something that if you can, and if there were a better way to do this, it'd be something to avoid. Well, wouldn't you know it? There is, right? Progressive delivery. This is something in the last. Really, I'd say 2 or 3 years that has taken hold across, companies outside of, Netflix and Uber and that sort of thing. And we really see, CloudBees, we see this as really, it's the natural evolution of CI/CD maturity. You might finally feel pretty good about, your continuous delivery processes and that sort of thing, but you want to take it the next step, and that would be looking at how to progressively deliver features to subsets of your users, to rolling percentages of your users over time, to ensure that, the feature is well accepted, that it's going to act as intended in production, all that sort of thing. And the way you can do this with feature flags is because, feature flags make it a zero risk option in production. If something doesn't work, there's going to be a smaller blast radius for who that affects. There's going to be the ability to turn it off instantly with a kill switch. And that's one of the use cases Elliot's going to speak about further in this presentation. And really, this is generally conducted through 2 ways. The first is user criteria. This would be choosing someone, specifically inside the company to test in production, externally, to test in production, but based on user criteria such as, your language you're using, the version of the application you're on, the country you're in. It really, it can be a long list, and it can be custom if needed. And, there can be a, if you don't want to go that route and you just want to sample your entire user base, there can be that straight mix % rollout over time that I just spoke about. Cool. And this is really testing and monitoring that performance of the application, or the website, or whatever, before it's released to all users. And the end goal, and I'm going to say it 4 or 5 times in this presentation, is you want to have the most boring release as possible of that new feature. If nothing goes wrong and it's being used as correctly, that's a good day for any release manager, as they'll tell you. Which brings me to my next point. As the growth of progressive delivery continues, as feature flags become more standard operating procedure within many companies, there might be a conception that progressive delivery is the antithesis of release managers, right? And if developers can suddenly edit in production, and what do we really need release managers for? Well, let me just be clear, like, this is not true at all. Feature flags are not replacing release managers and like that function of ITIL by any means. What this is doing is this is giving, in the beautiful world of dev and ops, this is giving one more tool and one more bridge across the line for release managers to really be confident in that release that's going out. So with that said, there's going to need to be internal processes developed between developers and release managers to ensure that progressive delivery is working for both of them. But one is not replacing the other, and they're both equally needed, and will still be continue to be used. It's just the next iteration of how software is released. And I want to bring up, testing in production, it's not just for startups, right? I think, I've gotten this feedback that, oh yeah, sure, smaller teams can do that because they have 20 developers and they don't have formal release processes like, us, this $20 billion company does, and that sort of thing. And I just want to be clear that that's not the case. I mean, now, of course, smaller companies can be more agile. There's less red tape to get things done. But I just want to be clear, as I mentioned, who really pioneered the idea of testing in production? It was some of the biggest known logos that we all know. Netflix, Facebook, testing billions of users at once, with new features. If they can do it and they can kind of standardize it in their processes, it's really not a stretch to think that over time, every company is going to adopt this as standard operating procedure for a new feature release as well. And, I would say we have Netflix, we have Uber, and then after that we have CloudBees, right? Someday. But I want to bring up one dog fooding example that we have of, using feature flags internally here at CloudBees. If you're potentially a CloudBees customer today, we relaunched our website in Q4 of last year. And we actually did exactly what we're talking about here with progressive delivery, where we released the new website in production to all CloudBees employees, and they could go and without any test environment, without any special beta login, anything, whatever, they could go to the new cloudbees.com, try it out, make sure everything works, make sure everything was displaying correctly, before that flip over for the rest of the population occurred. And the main project manager on the project, I mean, he called the actual switch to production, for everyone and every web user, one of the most delightfully boring launches he had ever had, because everything worked perfectly, and there were no scrambling headaches that day. So that was kind of the intro here. I'm going to toss it over to Elliot, who's going to dive into some of the the 3 key use cases we see for progressive delivery, and kind of talk through how they would be done, manually today, which could be possible, a little clunky, but possible. And after that, he's going to kind of show you how we do it here at CloudBees with our feature flagging tool.
All right. Thanks so much, Nick. And we'll switch on over here. So there are a couple of popular use cases for feature flags, especially in homegrown systems. And I think one of the most fundamental is the idea of a kill switch. And at its core, the concept of a kill switch in a dashboard can really be thought of like some sort of toggle on a switchboard. And so the idea here is that teams can use this toggle to instantly change the value of a feature flag that's running in the code. So having all of these toggles together in a single dashboard not only give members of a team visibility, but it also, kind of grants some level of transparency by providing a simplified fail-safe mechanism. So they can get a quick understanding by one look of the dashboard of which flag configurations, or what we'll call experiments, are on and which ones are off. And all the while, by having some sort of fail-safe mechanism in place, this will greatly reduce and minimize the number of people that are ultimately required to provide a quick fix should something go wrong. And as we all know, things can and will go wrong. So in keeping with Murphy's laws, things can go wrong everywhere. Things can go wrong in pre-production. And if a small feature or service is the only bug in the last stage of a CI pipeline and it's holding up that entire process, then there's really no reason why it should delay an entire deployment. So what the idea of a kill switch and feature flags can come into play here, because we can gate that segment of code, of that segment of code that delivers that feature or that service, and gate it behind a feature flag, and then flip the kill switch that will disable the configuration or the experiment and make the feature flag take on a default safe mode value. So in this way, once we flip that switch, we can deploy on time, and we can ensure that one small issue is not holding up an entire deployment. Things can also go wrong in production and negatively impact the end user experience. So as we might see here in this article headline, the end user, probably not a huge negative experience for them. They're probably very pleased with this error that occurred in production, and very pleased and happy with the discount that it provided them. But this just kind of goes to show and illustrates the amount of risk businesses are exposed to. And all of this risk could have been covered, simply by toggling a flag's kill switch that enables that safe mode value. So what does the overall process of providing a fix look like without a kill switch? In some homegrown solutions, feature flags are usually defined and modified through some sort of static configuration file or through a database table. But handling the errors in a timely manner is problematic due to the sheer number of steps involved in this process. So let's just take a look at this illustration outlining this process. And as in any case, when an error occurs, the product team is alerted of the problem. They in turn would have to then notify the developers, who will then make the modified changes to the static configuration file as a config.json file. In order for that safe mode view to be apparent to the end user, the developer would then have to redeploy that. That they would have to redeploy that updated configuration file, and then and only then would the fail-safe mode view service, whatever was gated behind the feature flag, would now be available to the end user. So some solutions bypass that one deploy stage because developers, all they would have to do is make changes to a database table. But no matter if the homegrown solution relies on a config file, no matter if it relies on a database table, we can see that both ways are time inefficient and really just misallocate the human capital in these processes. So in this scenario, the development or engineering team has to be tasked with with making these changes, because they have to know how to edit and deploy a config file and know how to use some sort of file transfer protocol, or they have to make the changes in the database table. And usually when you're making those level of changes in the database, that by the very nature, it requires some level of admin permissions that sometimes aren't granted to the product team. So the high technical entry barrier and the general restricted access nature at the core of both of these solutions means that additional personnel have to get involved in order to provide a fix. And so overall, even the most advanced teams with, the most streamlined communication process across different divisions, it would still probably take them on the order of minutes to provide a simple fix that could have been done in seconds. And in CloudBees rollout, we're able to provide this fix with a simple flick of a switch. So let's just take a minute to see what this would look like in our feature flag management solution. So right now we're just looking at a couple of lines of code, and this is our flag class where we're declaring our feature flags. And for the purpose of this demo, we have a simple Hacker News application, and I want to implement a new score feature that kind of rates the popularity of each article. But because it's experimental in nature, I'm going to gate it behind a feature flag, and I'm using that safe mode false value so that whenever we're checking the state of a feature flag through this show score function, if that feature flag is true, it will successfully show the score element. If not, then we can hide that element. So, as is often the case, here we are, deployed it on my local machine. Everything is working well. A score element for each of these articles here. And now here's our production environment. And lo and behold, as is often the case, we have some sort of error. So in rollout, we have a set of experiments, and this experiment governs the behavior, or is really a rule set for our score feature flag in our code. And here is that kill switch that we talked about earlier. So by flipping this kill switch and activating that false value or that safe mode value, I'll flip it. And in real time, you can see how quickly the feature flags will propagate and the updates will appear here in our application. Page will refresh. And now, in a matter of seconds rather than minutes, we're able to quickly address any errors, whether they occur in pre-production or our production environment. All right, so the next use case is kind of outlines the imperative need for user segmentation. And businesses rely on user segmentation because at its core, it allows teams to better understand their customer base. And by better understanding their customer base, relying on robust data and analytics, they in turn can provide a better experience and quickly adapt to the competitive marketplace to quickly and efficiently implement new features tailored to each customer. So teams have databases and functions in code that describe attributes and puts end users in these defined groups. So user segmentation in the scope of feature flags means taking these attributes that are defined in the code base, and these can describe if a user has successfully logged in, their geographic region, their operating system, the very version of the application they're using, and taking these properties to create a rule set that will alter flag values for a certain set of users that meet a set of criteria. And this criteria is defined by the attributes and properties from the code. And while we can alter a set of feature flag values for users that meet this set of criteria, we can do so without it affecting the values of users that don't meet that set of criteria. So some examples of this is the idea of providing additional content to users all from the same code base. So in this way, teams are able to hide paid content from they're able to hide paid content from non-paying customers while granting access to paying customers to the same basic the same basic application that non-paying customers have, while promoting the premium features that they may have paid for. This concept can also be employed to help find bugs earlier and speed up the software delivery process altogether. One example that you can read about on the Rollout's website is the case study of Doist, and they've been able to successfully use feature flags and user segmentation to continuously improve their platform and test new features by releasing it only to internal teams initially. And this can be done through some sort of email property, and checking to ensure that if a rule set or if a user evaluating a feature flag has an internal email address, then expose that property to them. And we, as Nick said earlier, big name companies like Netflix employ the same sort of strategy to successfully deliver content to its streaming devices based on the very device that it's being accessed on. So in this way, if you log in Netflix on your phone, it has a different appearance. The way you interact with it is different than when you interact with it on a smart TV. And feature flags and user segmentation is able to accomplish that. So how is this done without some sort of enterprise feature flag management system? We can see that most homegrown solutions really struggle with user segmentation just because of the infrastructure required to accomplish this. So engineers have to take time away from their development and create some sort of API endpoint that is capable of handling server requests. And it's these requests that ultimately contain information on each user sending it. And based on this context provided, a flag will be assigned a specific value for one user with one request and another value for a separate client and their request. On the front end framework side of things, cookies have to be passed. They not only have to be passed, but synchronized. And sometimes a complete JavaScript overhaul rewrite is usually necessary to give information about the user. So if you're tackling it from this side and you have to do some intensive JavaScripting, it really is not only costly from an engineer's time perspective, but also hosting this API endpoint and this homemade solution together that is somewhat capable of user segmentation is really expensive, and you're putting a lot of work into building something that can only work maybe for select few languages in your tech stack. So these implementations are also usually pretty performance intensive, and because of the amount of JavaScript rewrites that are involved, it costs the end user experience and page load times. So let's take a look at how Rollout can take properties that already exist in the code, and we can then use it in a nice dashboard to then target certain users and toggle feature flag values if that set of users meet a set of criteria based on those property values. All right, so again, in the code, we have some sort of properties that tell if a user is signing in using beta credentials. As I said earlier, we can tell if they signed in or if they had not. Like Doist, if you want to expose an element to a certain set of users, you can either do this by taking an email property or by what we have here, a get company property. So the idea here is that you're not transmitting any username or company name specifically, but rather the return type associated with these, so that when the Rollout dashboard creates a rule set for that feature flag, and the feature flag is then evaluated on these various SDKs, it will then on that end client device tell it which function to call in order to determine if that particular user meets the set of criteria. So the idea of a target group is really surrounds those properties and taking two or more of those properties that may define a set group of users. So here I'm defining somebody that we will call a beta user that has successfully logged in using that is logged in property and making sure that it is true. And if they use beta user credentials to log in. And in this way, we can discern between different groups of users and expose the score element to them. So back to our score element, we can either rely on a single property and if this were an email, we could implement a simple regex command. So this would probably be how we would want to do internal testing here at CloudBees. But now relying on two or more properties for that defined target group, I'll make sure that anybody that signs in using beta that belongs to that beta user target group can see that score element, while everybody else will not be able to see this. So now in our production environment, we can see here that where you're signed in using beta. And if I sign in with anybody else as a normal user, that score element is now hidden. Or if I don't sign in at all, again, it's hidden. So this is either can be useful for beta testing, for premium content. You can get the idea. So that in this way, we're taking what's already declared in the code and creating a rule set and exposing the feature flags to those properties. All right, so testing and experimenting in production is not only a great way to continuously improve software, but it also can help mitigate risk because we have the ability to release to a percentage or a small subset of users, and this is where controlled releases come into play. So overall, controlled releases can be thought of much of like setting up a lab for statistical testing. There's some sort of goal or objective to be tested, usually surrounding a service or feature. And this component is gated behind a feature flag. And we test this, the null hypothesis, by exposing this component to a sample group that is somewhat representative of the population of our end users. And then we rely on analytics to provide insight into the metrics and performance of this test. And this is not only used in canary deployments, but also A/B testing and microservices and the migration processes that ensue with those, because it not only allows us to start small, it can also reliably enable some sort of load management while your microservices, your database or API migrations, all of these moving parts are in transition. And this way we can ensure that by exposing a group of users, or that only maybe 25% of our users are using one database without overloading it in a migration process. All right, so one of the most recent and I think probably most tangible examples that everybody may be aware of testing in production through controlled releases is Instagram. And you may have noticed that the discrete number of likes is no longer publicly available. And Instagram employed kind of a combination of user segmentation and controlled releases to test this out. So they replaced the number of likes for a post with the phrase and others that we can outline here. And they exposed this to a few countries at first, And this is, again, where user segmentation came into play because they relied on, geographic location properties in the code. And then, what they would do is, based on the data analytics that ensued, they slowly rolled out and scaled up the number of users in each country that were exposed to this and others test. And now I believe, all Instagram users see and others, and the number of likes is no longer publicly available. So the idea is, you use feature flags to, segment your users into percentage buckets, and then, rely on a data analytics platform to measure the efficacy of that test. And then depending on that, you either, ramp up the users on a scheduled basis, 10, 20% every week or so, or suddenly if an error is caught or if it doesn't perform well, you can appropriately scale it down. So not only helps when we're releasing new features, but also can work with sunsetting features as well. So out of the box, a lot of homegrown solutions struggle again to implement controlled rollouts. And the main problem that arises surrounds the idea of consistency concerns. So, looking back on our Instagram example, when they initially released that test to 5% of their users, if I was part of that 5%, they would need to make sure that I see that and others phrase, no matter if I sign in on my phone, if I sign in on my computer. In all likelihood, I break my phone and I buy a new one and I log in again, but this time on a different device. They would need to make sure that the flag evaluation happens consistently for a given set of usernames or based on a specific property that they define to be the consistent property. So we've seen some teams use tools like Nginx creatively to handle this. It's not really what it was made for, but again, it adds to the level of complexity, the personnel that's charged with handling this, and it further increases the entry barrier with a huge learning curve. Further aggravation occurs because these controlled releases may need to be scheduled or constantly modified to appropriately scale up or scale down based on the analytics that come back from the test results. And doing this over and over again tracks from the amount of time that developers use, actually working on new features and developing new products, what they're actually, should be doing with their time. So how does this work in rollout? If we go back to our example, we try to, implement a very developer focused and developer friendly approach. So what this means is in our code, we can implement some sort of impression handler so that when we use feature flags to distribute the load to our users, and 50% of our users will see one value of the feature flags and 50% of our users will see, a separate value, we can then push data about, the flag name, the flag value, so that when each user accesses it, we can push it to our analytics platform that specializes in, gathering that data, and we can use it to then do the chi-square test, test for statistical significance, and in this way know which feature is outperforming the other and should we scale up or scale down based on those performance metrics. So instead of using simple true false, we can then enable some sort of split value here. And this way, very simple to just allow rollout to distribute the traffic. And if you remember, a lot of issues came up before in homegrown solutions based around that, consistency property. And with rollout, We have a stickiness property that can be automatically assigned for the end client based on a kind of unique ID originally accessed, or if you want to, as Instagram would, want to tie it to a specific user-defined property like email or any other property that you would pass to the dashboard, you have that ability to alter it here so that you can ensure consistency based on a property that you choose. So using the split schedule, using the split experiment and the stickiness property, we can help set up our, an A/B test or a canary deployment. And then using the impression handler from the code, we're pushing the results to our analytics platform. And simple example would be something like Google Analytics, where we can see in real time. Let's go here. And, I'm on one of my mobile devices right now. And I believe if I interact with this page, we should see that another user, again, me coming from Texas, signed in using a desktop. So not only, can we take advantage of a platform that specializes and grants all of this, all of these additional properties, right out of the box, but then using the impression handler, we're able to see on one of our devices, the header color was dark, on the other header color was white. And this is where we're able to kind of, gain insight into the efficacy of the test that we set up and can see, does the header color ultimately have an effect on the user, the login rate on how often a user interacts with a particular element on the page. So, this is just a simple idea of, just passing data to a platform that specializes in this sort of analysis. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Nick.
Thanks, Elliot. So, yeah, there's really good technical reasons to start doing progressive delivery. I mean, I wanted to, very quickly tie this back to business value and what this means, for your organization as a whole. And, at the end of the day, like as Elliot said, we can talk about, why it's good for users and that sort of thing. But, if you're a developer lead or you're leading a broader team of, within engineering, just think about this. You're getting development time back to your developers, that they didn't have before. They're no longer having to put out fires that started in production. They're no longer having to spend their time doing the testing with QA team internally before something releases. It's really about allowing them to do what they want to do most of, and that is developing new features without kind of the overhead work, the less fun, busy work that they have to do with QA and with firefighting. So more time for future development. Again, I'm going to go back to release confidence and, as bug-free releases as possible, right? Like I said, you want your release to be as boring as possible on the day that every user has it. And, testing it in production beforehand, and having a very solid user feedback on how that feature is going to be accepted, it's gold. And, there should be no surprises on that day. And as I said, faster user feedback. I mean, this is the one that, companies like to attribute to their retention of, people using an app, their acquisition, folks using people downloading the app more in the future, all that sort of thing. Being able to cut down the walls between developer and between end user and really, allow them to, essentially interact, like not directly, but indirectly interact with new features and feedback and that sort of thing. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. And it doesn't get any better than that for creating features that really delight end users. I think every developer on the line today has probably, quote, wasted a release at some point where, your product owner said, this feature is going to kick butt and everyone's going to, going to love it. It gets out to the field, exact opposite. People are, reaching out to you on Twitter, this sucks, all that sort of thing. Let's eliminate that. Let's get the user feedback out there early and often and make those releases as, as simple and as well accepted as possible. All right, and lastly, kind of the word from our sponsors here. If you would like to, give progressive delivery a try and kind of try out the exact dashboard that Elliot was using, we're happy to set that up for you today. We offer 2 free full weeks on our current feature flagging product called Rollout. And yep, the link was just added to the screen. So. Thank you very much. So we do have a little time for questions if you'd like to stay on. Just to reiterate, you can put them either in the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom in Zoom, and we will answer them live over the line for everyone to hear.
All right. Thanks, Nick and Elliot. Just to remind everyone, we can continue to ask questions as we go. So if you think of any in this time, please go right ahead and ask them. Let's start with one here. So you say it's complementary, but I have a hard time believing my release team will allow production testing. How do I help convince them?
So to that, I would say hopefully you maybe wouldn't have to do a lot of convincing, because odds are you are probably doing some level of A/B testing or canary deployment already. But if not, then you can assure the release team that you're really looking out for them, because instead of, of letting the work pile up and undergoing all that ensues, the frustration, the anguish, when major releases are done, and then, possibly having to undergo a code rollback, we're really not taking away any work, but with the idea of feature flags, you're kind of dispersing the amount of work done over time. Kind of the same idea that my mom tells me with growing up and cleaning my room. Instead of letting it pile up and doing it once every 6 months, forming good habits and doing it every week. It's the same amount of work, just done over time.
All right, let's go on to this next one here. So when it comes to segmenting users, what kind of criteria can they be segmented by? Is there a list in place already that someone has to abide by, or can they create their own?
Yeah, I mean, as we talked about, it could be a variety of things. Could be based on a geographic region, the operating system, the version of the application itself. But rather than focus on, what properties can I use to define user segments, you should look at your application and ask, what parts of my application, need to only be released to a subset of users. And I hate to answer a question with another question, but if you can answer that and define the properties that those components rely on, then it's those properties in turn will help define your user segments.
All right, thank you. Right now, looks like we have one more. If anyone thinks about more as we go, please add them in. So my product team uses New Relic to track performance. Would I be able to get full user information from this platform to there? Or does it not switch when it's used across apps?
So, yeah, so I think that's probably one of the best ways that the impression handler can be used, because it's not really geared towards any one integration or one platform in particular. So whatever information you want to push to whichever platform, the impression handler is just a way to allow that. And I would be more than happy to email further details on what you're looking to accomplish in New Relic and how you could use rollout and specifically the impression handler to push the relevant information to that platform.
All right. Looks like that's going to be about it for today. Nick and Elliot, any final thoughts before we start signing off?
I don't think so. Thank you everyone for the time.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll talk to you again real soon.